Malaysia's ruling coalition wins a 13th straight election, but support is waning. The Prime Minister is calling for national reconciliation. Opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim is branding the polls the worst electoral fraud in our history. What's next for Malaysia? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. One of Malaysia's most hotly contested elections has returned the ruling coalition to power. Prime Minister Najib Razak had staked his political future on strengthening his alliance's majority in Parliament, but his standing has been weakened and he's promising to engage in dialogue with his political opponents. That's been rejected, with opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim pressing for a rally in 2 days to protest against the results. From the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur, here's Florence Louis.
Najib Razak was sworn in as Prime Minister less than a day after winning the elections. The National Front, one of the world's longest ruling elected coalitions, won its 13th consecutive victory. But it lost 7 parliamentary seats to the opposition and now commands a reduced majority.
There is a sense of rejection within the urban sort of like Malaysian voters to accept this rhetoric. They want a more inclusive Malaysia. They want to vote for parties that represents all race groups.
A narrower margin in Parliament means the Najib administration will have its work cut out for it. A youth leader in the ruling coalition acknowledged that in a tweet on Monday, saying the victory was only a reprieve and that a failure to deliver on the change that people demand could mean the end for the National Front come the next general election. The polls had been billed as the most tightly contested in Malaysian history. In many other ways, this election has proved historic. A record 80% of voters cast their ballots. And some say that's an indication of just how much people were hoping for change.
To some level, some disappointment, but we are still hopeful. I think there's already like a wave of change going on among the people, so I don't think that's going to stop.
Opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim has said he would not concede defeat. At a late-night media conference, he showed what he said was evidence of electoral fraud. The Movement for Electoral Reform, Bersih, and other independent election monitors say they've also received reports of voting irregularities. On social media, some are already calling for another demonstration to demand clean and fair elections. Others have changed their Facebook profile to reflect what they said was a black day for democracy. The opposition coalition, seizing on that momentum, said it would hold a mass rally on Wednesday and reveal what its next course of action would be. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur.
We are joined by our guests, all from Kuala Lumpur. Nurul Izzah Anwar, Member of Parliament for the Opposition People Justice Party and the daughter of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. Also Azman Ujung, former editor-in-chief of the government-sponsored Bernama News Agency, and Bridget Welsh, a professor of political science from Singapore Management University and author of numerous publications on Malaysian politics. Thank you all very much for joining us. Nurul, let me start off with you, and commiserations, I guess. I mean, this was your moment, the moment for the coalition. What went wrong? Why didn't you win?
I'm, of course, very thankful for my win in Lembah Pantai, but I think from the beginning we said this will be the dirtiest elections in Malaysia's history, and you can see from the evidence of fraud that we've adduced, the only way to overcome it is to have a huge majority. Unfortunately, in this particular elections, 24 seats was won by Barisan Nasional with a razor-thin 2,000 majority and less. So I think whatever it may be, we are dealing with an illegitimate government. And Bersih, the Coalition for Free and Fair Elections, are going to focus on a clear-cut tribunal to look at all the allegations of fraud, starting with the indelible ink that was incredibly easily washed off, incidences of phantom voters, which were also caught in my constituency, and thirdly, of course, the irregularities in the electoral roll.
Tell us what it is that you saw that backs these statements you've made about fraud here?
We basically have a video recordings of foreign workers trying to enter the polling centres. We've also adduced evidence of irregularities in the electoral roll. I posed a judicial review, sought a judicial review to remove these names. And of course, you have police reports made not only by the opposition members, but also members of the armed forces, their wives. A major lodged a police report because his ink, the ink on his finger was easily removed on the same day when the EC clearly promised us 7 days of indelible ink before it can be removed. So for me, clear-cut, Dr. Sri Najib should be ashamed of himself. I mean, you talk about this particular elections, you promised electoral reform, and now Malaysians did not get a free and fair elections, and it is really a flawed democracy at best.
Azman, what is your response to Nurul's claims and that this is in fact now an illegitimate government?
First of all, I'd like to congratulate Nurul for having won, I think, one of the fiercest battles in this election. Congratulations, Nurul. Election time is normally called, sometimes called silly seasons, and this is a part of it. You make all kinds of allegations and you have to come up with evidence. For example, there is an allegation made by the opposition leader, who's Nurul's father, that AirAsia or some airlines are flying in, or were flying in 40,000 foreigners from one part of Malaysia to vote in the peninsula, in Peninsular Malaysia. As a result of that allegation, the police were on the lookout, and I think so far the police have said that there have been no. I mean, it's so easy, they can easily attract attention. 40,000 people, even though they can be dispersed.
Are you saying that he's lying?
A number of places, but there. Yeah, I mean, allegations are so easy. So anybody can make the allegations. You can post any pictures. There were pictures of Bangladeshis arriving. I don't know which airport. I mean, this can, with internet and YouTube, you can easily call. But where is the hard evidence? I mean, I'm not here to dispel or to dispute, but these kind of allegations can easily be made by anybody to score points, especially during election time.
So what do you think the government is going to do about this to prove that in actual fact it did win and win fairly? What can it do?
As a result of this allegation of 40,000 foreigners or Bangladeshis, Tony Fernandez, who owns AirAsia himself, has come out to deny this. And he did say that all he had on his record was 478 people being flown from Johor Bahru to Sabah. They are Sabahans who work in Johor Bahru. I would tell you that I'm a Sarawakian. There is no such thing as 40,000 Bangladeshis in Sabah and Sarawak. So to be flown here. What is actually happening is that there are more hundreds of thousands of Malaysians from Sabah and Sarawak who are working in Peninsular Malaysia, because this is the place where jobs are, not in Sabah Sarawak. So it's the other way around. If the allegation was to say that 40,000 people from here were flown to Sabah and Sarawak, these are actually Malaysians working here. In Johor Bahru alone, there are 40,000 Sarawakians working there, and
okay,
I'm sure
let me put that
to
Bridget.
Vote,
What do you make of what's been going on, the victories, the losses, and the allegations of fraud? Is it just inevitable in this kind of election?
Well, one has to put this in a context. I think one of the realities of what's been happening in Malaysia has been a really declining faith in many of the political institutions and their ability to carry out elections in an administratively neutral way. And the Election Commission has been faced with a lot of allegations over the last 5 years. This has led to movements by civil society and other actors to actually come out into the streets to push for electoral reform. And what happened in this election was a test of whether or not that reform has worked. And as been mentioned earlier, the indelible ink issues are really very serious. Multiple cases of across society where the indelible ink could be removed almost instantaneously, with sometime even without soap and water. And actually the results themselves really do raise some serious questions. And what's different about this election than previous elections is that the races were so close. 72%, 72 seats, basically 1/3 of the seats, had actually less than 5% margins. So we're looking at an extremely close context. And in that regard, these are the issues of where irregularities come into play. And there are concerns over the veracity of the electoral roll. There are concerns over the issues about the placement of voters in certain locations. And there are reports that are legitimate about the persistence of strangers in different communities that seem to have been voted and been aided in that process by election officials and others.
Does this make a difference? Excuse me jumping in here. There's been an incredibly high voter turnout. I believe it is the highest ever at 80%. Doesn't that negate any sort of rigging, these allegations?
Well, one has to look at where the voter turnout is. And I think in the case of the urban areas, you can see from the results in places like Penang and Selangor that the mass turnout, the mass public participation of Malaysians did make a difference to offset many of the increased voters that were placed and that were not necessarily verified in many of the seats. For example, in the state of Selangor, there was almost a 30% increase in votes. And many of that were actually new voters registering and joining, and other of those were questions that were not completely verified. So you actually do see in the urban areas that this was offset by increased voter turnout. But some of the turnout questions are raising questions. Let me give you an example. One seat in Johor, which was lost by the opposition by a 1,217 majority. There were polling stations in the rural Malay areas of actually 95, 93 percentile turnout. These are things that raise flags, and they need to be investigated. And while I agree with the earlier speaker that there needs to be good evidence that needs to be actually presented in a systematic way, and this needs to be assessed from the perspective of the population and people looking at the election. But there are questions and flags that are coming up, especially because of the closeness of the polls.
Nurul, before the results had even been announced, which you're disputing, Anwar Ibrahim, your father, was quick to tweet victory. He said that PR has won. We urge UMNO and the EC to not attempt to hijack the results. Why did he do that?
We are basing the announcement based on Merdeka Center, a polling agency, and their findings in the last few days, especially in the day before counting itself, which states that Pakatan Rakyat is leading with 115 to 118 parliamentary seats. I think it's important to understand the extent of support by all polling agencies, which are also credited by the government of the day. And this brings into question the process itself. You must understand, we, the opposition, was promised not only access to the media. You're talking to the Bernama CEO. We didn't even get a minute of positive coverage in any mainstream national media. So certainly you're talking about elections. It is important to look at the process. So for me, we are faced with a biased system, especially the Election Commission, which has time and again been seen as subservient to the ruling coalition. So that was the basis to the announcement, especially looking and tracking people's sentiments, people's support, and of course, in the various states, Perlis, initially Perak, we had won, and then of course there were questions raised with regards to
let me take one of your points and throw it to Azman. It's going to be very difficult for any other party to take power from the government if the government does dominate the media. I know that you've worked in government-sponsored media, and when the government hands out gifts rather than the opposition looking for money from voters.
Yeah, what is happening in Malaysia now? We have two sides of media. The so-called mainstream media, I don't think have much audience now. It's called mainstream, but as opposed to the social media, which have more readers, more audience, and more listeners, and so So we have both sides of it. The government media, the government control them. Naturally, they will have to cover more on the government side. But I left Bernama 4 years ago. I wouldn't know about this Bernama coverage of opposition. I'm sorry to hear that there's been so little Bernama coverage of any other mainstream media coverage of the opposition. But the opposition does get a lot of coverage in the alternative media, which has millions of audience. I'm not sure, if I were them, I should be more happy with that. So back to what Nurul said earlier, someone tweeted that Merdeka Center has predicted so-and-so has won this and that election. I think in all elections in all countries, official results are what count, not unofficial results or speculated results. This can mean anything. So how can anybody say that before you know the official result, how can anybody say that I have won or I have lost? This is, these are just part of, I think, election time fun, making fun of information.
Okay, let's take a look now at the two main personalities in this election, starting with Najib Razak. Now, Najib has been Malaysia's Prime Minister since 2009. At 23, became the youngest Member of Parliament in Malaysian history and quickly rose to prominence. He is part of a political dynasty with his father and uncle, both former Prime Minister. Under his leadership, the government repealed the controversial Internal Security Act, but critics say the new laws remain repressive and still allow for abusive. Najib also promised to reform pro-Malay policies, though many of them remain in place. For Anwar Ibrahim, it's been a long journey that's taken him to both sides of Malaysia's political divide. Anwar is a former Deputy Prime Minister himself, serving under Mahathir's government from 1993 to 1998. He was sacked after falling out with Mahathir over the need to crack down on corruption. He has since battled charges for sodomy, for which he was convicted but eventually cleared. Sodomy is illegal in Malaysia, but Anwar has always maintained the cases were politically motivated. Anwar joined the opposition, leading it to an unprecedented showing at the 2008 polls. It was the start of the first serious challenge to Barisan Nasional's grip on power. The opposition had capitalised on rising anger over corruption and oppressive tactics. Bridget, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for the government, isn't it? I mean, the new social schisms have been exposed, deep polarisation in the country.
Well, I think one of the things that has become very clear in this day after the polls is that this is an extremely weak mandate for Najib Tun Razak. You know, he's a man who waited almost 4 years, over 4 years, to hold the election. And in this process, what he got was one that he is actually not very proud of, in the sense that the campaign itself was based heavily on using negative campaigning, smear tactics, uses of race, and of course questions that are marring the questions of the victories in terms of irregularities. And so he now faces a contest in his own political party for his own leadership. So he's going to have a rough time ahead, because not only has he inherited a large trust deficit among a large part of the population, because one has to keep in mind that the popular vote in this election, the majority of Malaysians did not vote for Najib Tun Razak, and he actually had a lower number of seats than his predecessor, Abdullah Badawi. So you actually have an extremely weak mandate for anybody promising anything, whether or not it's reforms or otherwise. And I think this is a large challenge for Najib. But at the same time, the opposition also faces some challenges. And those challenges have to do with, you know, basically trying to find the right tactics to assess and to come up with evidence for the questions of irregularities. And of course, they have to work together. And the different parties have had relatively different levels of success in this election. And particularly the Islamist party, PAS, has actually suffered quite a few losses and defeats in parts of the Malay heartland, particularly losing the state of Kedah. So this will put them under the microscope, and they too are having a party election this year. And I think you're going to see many of the visions within that party and come to the fore. Now, when you ask to the questions about the social divisions in the society, one has to look and analyze these results through three different paradigms. The first and most prominent paradigm is the importance of class. Now, most people look at Malaysian politics through the issues of race, but when we see what issues were at play in this election, what we see is a government that is highly based on elites, with close links to government business. And a lot of money was spent in this campaign. And a lot of money was spent to buy votes in this campaign. And this tactic was most successful among lower class Malaysians. It's not a coincidence that their successful areas were in East Malaysia and in places like Kedah and Kelantan, which have the highest level of poverty in the country. And this schism between the rich and poor is actually growing in Malaysia. And this is kind of one of the ironies in that you have a record of governments where actually inequalities are rising, but at the same juncture you have a government that depends on the lower classes for their political support.
All right, Nurul, how does the opposition now overcome these social schisms within the country, the race issues? I mean, the race issues seem to dominate these elections and dominate the outcome of these elections. Also, it's having a devastating impact on the country.
Well, I think for our party, we have been promoting multiracial politics since 1999. We have fought and also requested that the new economic policy be revamped since the year 2006. We've come a long way. And what's one of the most disappointing moments for me was when Dato' Sri Najib, who's now the supposed Prime Minister, his first statement was saying that this elections was very much about a Chinese tsunami. And that can't be further from the truth. After declaring One Malaysia as his major concept, to say this and then ask for a national reconciliation program is rather shocking. Because at the end of the day, you're looking at pockets of Malaysians, regardless of race, regardless of creed, wanting change. And that's why they supported the agenda for free and fair elections. That's why you had scores of Malaysians from all different races coming out, demanding during the rallies of Bersih 1 and 2. And of course, the third one most recently. And for me, this particular elections, what the danger is when the MCA, a component party of Barisan Nasional, has utilized it to say it is a Chinese opposition against a Malay, pro-government Malay groups. And I think this is not healthy because at the end of the day, I thought we've crossed that bridge. And I don't feel hopeful under this administration that we'll reach something far more inclusive than where we are right now.
Okay, let's hear what people have been saying about it. People have been getting in touch with us via Facebook. William N. Bishop says it's a sad day for democracy in Malaysia. I'm surprised and saddened that the world closes its eyes to blatant election rigging in the country. Nana Kabina Basi says, is it the abuse of incumbency or just the inability of opposition parties to accept defeat? Well, time will tell. And Lim Shen simply adds, Malaysia doesn't want this incompetent clown to lead the country. Azman, he isn't an incompetent clown, is he? I mean, he has brought a certain amount of success to the country. I suppose the question is now if he can continue to do so.
I think anybody can just describe anybody using any clown, terms like clown. That is his or her problem. Not that. I mean, I'm not going to comment on that. But I'm sure Najib Razak is experienced enough to bring this country economically forward because he has gone on his transformation program and is giving serious attention to that as well. So this election time, this election he has got another mandate. I think most of the first 4 years of his administration, he was bent on thinking about when to call for election. We have been waiting for the last, I think Nurul knows about that. 2 years or 18 months. The country has been talking about when is the parliament going to be dissolved. Finally, parliament is going to be dissolved. We have since I think this is one country in the world where people
He's so weakened. Is he going to step down? And surely if he does step down, where does this leave the party and the future of the country?
Yeah, I was referring earlier to Bridget saying that he has a weak mandate. I think that the days of government having massive mandates or for example, in Malaysia, we like to call it two-thirds majority are over, You can look all around the world. Even as with last few days, they were still counting the votes in Venezuela. It's so slim, so thin. So whatever mandate, whatever margins or majority
Very quickly, will he step down or not?
Been given by, yeah. I don't think so because he has more reason now not to step down because he is the Prime Minister and he has got his mandate.
Okay, let's leave it there. I apologize, we have run
yeah.
out of time. Thank you very much to Nurul, Izzah Anwar, Azman Ujang and Bridget Welsh. And thank you very much for joining us in this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. I'm Jane Dutton. Goodbye for now.